Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching Urban Cafe with Raven and our guest, Jackie Marquina. Thank you for coming, Jackie.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jackie, tell us about what you do in the education field.
So my license is childhood education, grades 1 through 6, with a bilingual extension for the same grades 1 through 6. So currently I am a dual language Spanish and English teacher at an elementary school, and I teach second grade.
Thank you. So, I am honored to have Jackie here. I've known her since high school. I'm not going to tell you what year we graduated because it's going to tell our age, but I'm so glad to have her here. And she transitioned. So tell us how you got into the education system.
So I'm a career changer. At the age of 26-ish, I decided, I had planned it beforehand, but I changed careers into the teaching field. So I used to work as a federal employee for the government. My job entailed helping people in the Social Security administration. And while I was working there, I was doing my master's in teaching. And then when I turned 27, I got my license and I became a teacher. So I first worked at a charter school for about a year, and that's where I got my experience as a dual language teacher, teaching only in Spanish. And then 4 years after that, the next 4 years, I started teaching at the DOE, Department of Education, for New York City Public Schools. And I only taught general ed. But I had a very high population of English language learners. And now I'm back to teaching dual language. I'm still in the DOE, but I'm doing dual language again.
Oh, so good. So dual language, what exactly?
So there's like an umbrella, right? Bilingual education. So there's different types of bilingual education. And dual language is one of them, where you're basically teaching in two languages.
Okay.
Not at the same time. One takes place at a specific time and the other takes place at a specific time. So some schools do every other week, so 1 week English, 1 week Spanish. Some schools do every 2 days. Some do half and half day. At the school that I am now, I teach every other day. So 1 day English, 1 day Spanish,
Oh,
1 day
wow.
English. Yeah.
I never knew that. So tell me about...
And it progresses. So if I'm doing math lesson 1 on Monday in English, math lesson 2 is going to be in Spanish. I'm not repeating.
So how does that actually help the students, like being both dual in a dual language class?
Well, because it's kind of like if I'm translating everything for them, they're never going to acquire the language. So let's say you're sitting in that class, right, and you're dominating English. You're not going to pick up Spanish because you're just going to wait for me to say it in English. So that's how the kids that are dominating English learn Spanish, and that's how the kids that are dominating Spanish learn English. Okay. So ideally it's supposed to be half and half. Like it's supposed to have half dominant English speaking, half dominant Spanish, because they will learn from each other. But that's not always the case.
Okay. So, like, in your experience in teaching dual language, like, what has been some teachable moments for you?
I've done what? There's gonna be my 2 years in dual language, and then 4 years gen ed, but with a bunch of L's or English language learners. So basically, I just work with kids that are learning a new language.
I remember, because I was like, you're now doing that, but I feel like you've been telling me stories about your experiences for a long time. So, like, how has that been? Like,
so, I mean, because I can relate with the population, especially like the kids that I was working with before. My goal was to teach them English. So I was able to relate with their families and relate to them, and that experience taught me a lot, because then when you connect with families and with your students on a different level, it kind of just makes you closer and have that connection. 'Cause I remember like telling them, I learned English too, right, when I was 5, and they're like, really? What did you speak before? I'm like, Spanish. Like, this is not my first language. And having that conversation with them, and they're like, oh, and what did you do? And I'm like, I went to school. I worked really hard. I did all the things that you guys have to do, that I'm telling you to do. And then even when I shared that with the parents, a lot of them are immigrant parents, and they kind of had that admiration, like, wow, you're first generation, like, that's amazing, and you're here teaching my child. I'm like, yeah. I learned a lot with the families, sometimes, you know, I feel like colleagues were very harsh with if parents didn't show up, and you know, you kind of know who's there and who's
I
not.
understand what you're saying because I'm in the education field too, but I want you to speak to that, like the expectations that we have of family involvement for families of immigrants.
So like some people are like, oh, this parent never shows up. I'm like, yeah, but the parent's always sending me a note. You know, oh, did they do the homework right? So it's kind of like maybe they didn't show up because they probably have a second job, you know, or maybe they work the night shift, and that usually is what happens.
And that's real, yeah.
Or they, you know, they would ask me, hey, like, you know, you're in DOE, we have like a specific time on Tuesdays, every Tuesday afternoon. Sometimes they're like, I work at night, you know, or, you know, I try to be flexible to them. If I knew that these are like their, you know, was going to prevent them from meeting with me, I try to do different things. Obviously not go out of line of being professional.
Right.
But like either I would meet with them really early, or, you know, I would, you know, middle of the day, I would say, hey, like, can you set aside and I'll call you on my prep.
So it sounds like being like flexible with parents and being understanding is like key when working with dual language students.
Or even in general, like we're all, you know, students and all types of students. But that's like my expertise, especially with bilingual families. And also the setback of like, oh, I can't help them with the homework, you know, and kind of thinking about that when I send homework home, it has to be something they can do independently. So that's also pretty tricky too.
That's a good point. So what other suggestions would you have for teachers that are teaching dual language students or even students? Because not all schools have, my school has dual language. A dual language program, but not all schools have that. So if you have those students that come in and speak Spanish and like it's majority English speakers, what advice could you tell those teachers that are maybe don't speak Spanish and weren't raised with their first language being another language but actually English? What could you tell them about that?
It's all about the community that you're building in your classroom, because you want the dominant speaking English kids to help out the Spanish speaking kids without making fun of each other.
Right.
And like also taking that initiative, like, hey, how do you say that in Spanish? Or hey, I had two kids 2 years ago when I taught Gen Ed, but I had kids from Mexico, Dominican Republic, Ecuador. I had kids from Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah. I had a girl from where was she from? But she spoke Arabic too, but there's also different dialects of Arabic, which I had no idea
I've learned
about.
that too.
So like, you know, them seeing me struggle to say something in Arabic, they thought it was hilarious. I'm like, well, when you struggle saying something in English, you don't see me laughing at you. So kind of having that, you know, like also showing that you're learning from them as well.
Right.
And that everyone's here to help each other. I think it's really, really important. You know, it's not, oh, who's the best, and kind of like also telling them what they're good at, not always telling them what they're not good at or what they need to work on.
Right.
Or we use glows and grows, like not just telling them what they have to grow on. So I think that's super helpful.
That is super helpful for all kids. Like just when we give feedback, I make sure that I'm putting both, like, all right, this was great, you did these 3 things, awesome. So because we're focusing on this skill, here's the next step to help you grow with this skill, right? So I do look for things like that.
Also knowing your students too plays a big role, because I have students that have like that personality where they take it really like deep, and I'm like, you're doing perfect. I just have to tell you something. I have to tell you one of each. I can't just, you know, give you good, or, you know, I have to.
You're learning, right?
Yeah.
Learning is about growth. So awesome.
Yeah, and even emotionally, like that's a whole, like we could have a whole talk about emotional feedback, you know. I feel like that's a lot of work that I do on a daily basis with students, like helping them cope with certain emotions or identifying certain emotions. So like sometimes I'm like, so-and-so is excellent at math, but let's talk about the things that they're not good at. Same thing with you. You might not be good at expressing your emotions, but you're probably the best writer in the class. Like just having, you know, that not everybody's perfect and that we all have things to work on.
So tell me how the beginning of your school year looks like, or even planning. Is it any different? Like your lesson plans, do you do something different with your lesson plans, or because you're already a Spanish speaker, it like looks the same, but you just speak in Spanish? Or is like the work that you give them actually in Spanish, like the reading and stuff like that?
So that's a good question. It depends the level they're at. So normally, because they're normally more English dominant, the lessons in English are going to be a little bit more rigorous. And then the lessons in Spanish, even though I'm following the pattern, I still have to adjust to their needs in the Spanish language. Also, books, I can't use all the time translated books from English to Spanish because they're not culturally relevant, or they just don't have the same.
That's the next question I was going to ask you.
They don't have the same, like, you know, theme, or it's not the same, you know. And there's certain things in the Spanish language that you have to go over that you don't have to do in English, and vice versa. So kind of like really knowing the language. And like,
so when you say their level, you're speaking to their reading level, correct?
Their reading level, or their acquisition level. Like how, like I have some kids that are better at speaking, so I know like read alouds I can probably, you know, do something more rigorous in a read aloud. But if it's independent work, I might have to bring it down so they can do it on their own. So I don't know, you said like advice, right?
Yeah. So just like when you talked about the different reading levels, do you do like stations? Like how does that work in the classroom with so many, like, I feel like it's a lot going on in your classroom.
I mean, you haven't done elementary, right?
No.
So elementary school, normally we have reading workshop, writing workshop, math, like all the subjects, right? But reading workshop, and it kind of depends on the school too. You have, and the curriculum they follow. So like, for example, you know, in one school that I worked at, I had a 2 reading block. So it was like an hour and a half reading block. And I did a read aloud. Then they went and they did something independent about the read aloud. So if my theme that day was, okay, let's identify character traits, let's go back and like, you know, write the traits about that character. Then we would move on to stations. And during those stations or centers, whatever, you know, lingo they use, one of the groups I would be working with. A small group. At my current school, we don't really do stations. I can do stations, but I do it at a different part of the day. Like it might be in the morning, you know, when I'm just getting everyone settled in. I might have the station set up already and they already know what to do. But it's not something that I do like come September. Like it's something that I have to like weigh in. So it might start in November, December, and then, you know. So when they come in, they're like, all right.
That's a good point. Like not immediately pushing them into new systems, right? You have to build on that progression.
Especially with the little ones.
Right. Trust me, it's like the same thing in middle school and high school. So it's no different. There's still, But tell us like what tips would you give teachers?
So really a new teacher, first year is hard. We all been there, we all done that, we all cried. Maybe we didn't cry, I don't know, but I know everybody.
7 years and I still cry.
So first year is gonna always be rough, you know. You just can't do the same things you did your first year forever, you know, because you're gonna burn yourself out. Second is you need to find what works for you as far as organizing yourself, doing your lesson plans, getting ideas. I think another thing too that's important is having another teacher friend that's gonna like be there for you. And I always hear stories like people that just sitting with someone during lunch and that you could talk to them, or get feedback from them, or say, hey, you know, like I need help with this, or I need an idea, because you know, 2 heads are better than 1. I've heard stories too where people like just go sit in another friend's classroom and watch them during their lunch while they're eating their lunch, even though that teacher's not on their lunch break. And just like could be the smallest thing, and you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't think about doing that transition, you know, and it just makes like a difference. Another thing too, like always being, you know, open to feedback and trying things out. You know, I feel like as the older you get, or seasoned teachers are like, no, that's not gonna work, and it's like, just try it, man. Just try it.
Very true.
You know, because then your boss is gonna be like, but did you try it though? It's like, I did and it didn't work, you know, or I did and maybe this would work better, you know. Administrators always like that when you're just like, all right, fine, I'm gonna try it, even though you know it's not gonna work, at least you did it.
That is a good tip. Administrators love, your supervisors love when you're reflective. Love that when you can take good feedback. So that is like a big thing.
Yeah. So when you reflect, think about what you did well. Don't negate yourself all the time. because that could work into your like against you too. You know, after an observation, they're like, oh, well, you need to work on it. Maybe you'll be too harsh, and they'll be like, you know what, actually, yeah, you do gotta work on that. And it's like, why did I do that to myself? It's like, funny. So, you know, also talk about, you know, reflect on what you did well, because it's so easy for teachers to just think about, you know, what we didn't do well, because we don't get the, hey, you know, this is great. Right. It's like, you need to do this. You know, check. But this has to be done.
Yeah, and that's a tip for supervisors too. Sometimes we don't need to hear all the negative stuff. Maybe like just some supervisors. I've had experiences with that. Like it's just like you did this, and this. I'm just like, okay. So what did I do that was well? Right? And I've heard, you know, colleagues of mine saying the same thing. Like they just tore my lesson plan apart. I'm just like, but in the pre-observation it was great, and then all of a sudden I'm just like, wow.
Right. Well, or that will happen, right? And then a month later, they're sending someone to your room to observe you, like for a lab site. You know, like, oh, hey, you know, Miss Joseph does this really well, and the teacher's like, I didn't know I did that really well. Right. You know, I know what I did wrong. So for I guess for admin, it's like you need to give teachers positive feedback as well.
All right. Well, Jackie, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your support always in all years of my life that I've been knowing you. I'm still not going to tell you how many years that is. But give me a hug. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.